Happy spring! Did you know that the spring equinox was this past week? Yes, that is the day, in case you don't know, when there is equal amounts of light and darkness. Some pagans, people whose spirituality is centered on the seasons of the year, honor this as the celebration of Ostara. From the spring equinox, Ostara, until the summer solstice in June, which is sometimes celebrated as Litha or Litha, there will be little more sunlight every day. Thank goodness. I don't know about you, but I am ready for it. I am so ready for spring this year. Are you? Yes. Okay, so what about spring are you ready for? Just shout it out or type it into the chat. Flowers. Warmer weather. More daylight. Lots of things, right? So many things. Birds, flowers, right? Gardening, and I heard gardening, right? So is anyone ready to get out into their gardens? Yes. I am not a gardener. I have tried several times and I just can't get into it. I think that maybe because when I was growing up in the Washington, D.C. suburbs, my family had a relatively large organic garden, and the kids were the ones who tended those beds manually a lot. We would go through my particular favorite, that's sarcasm, is that going through the tomato plants and manually removing the hornworms and squishing them. Yeah. We weeded, we harvest. It was a lot of work for what I felt like was very little satisfaction. And I think that maybe that makes me feel like I've done enough gardening in my lifetime. But I respect those of you who love it. Fantastic, good for you, thank you, enjoy, have fun. I'm glad it works for you. And gardening is a great metaphor because building community is like growing a garden for a bunch of reasons, right? Diversity matters. Both can be either beautiful or horrible messes. They can start out strong and then just totally fall apart. They can start out like you're wondering if this is really going to work, and then they can grow and flourish. They can feed you, and both need attention to thrive. Back in September, I talked about community building and what it was that we were doing when we come here together each week, online and in person, with shared values, covenanting to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. I talked about how what we do saves lives, literally, here and now, not in some other life, but today. I talked about how healthy communities have clear boundaries and are open to new experiences and new learning and embody that community's values, right? Like the Jet Pig song was about embodying those values, not just holding them in our hearts. So how do we do all of that? How does this magic of community building happen? There are a lot of ways we could answer that. We could approach this topic from the various theories of community building and community development that are out there. We could look at the how from a relational perspective. We could look at it from a structural perspective. We could do power analysis on it. Some of the folks who took the Trans Inclusion in Congregations course, the first round, learned how to do power analysis in the congregation, and it was really interesting to them. This morning, I'm going to approach this question from a piece of wisdom that many of us ministers learn, that it is the role of leaders in religious community to feed health and starve dysfunction. To feed health and starve dysfunction. And to this wisdom, I have added my own twist that we must also interrupt harm. Let me break this down. So first, we want to feed health. We want to nurture this garden, this community, right? We want to make sure that the soil is rich in nutrients and to water the plants on the schedule that works best for them. Do you know the Native American wisdom story of two wolves? That we all have two wolves, one on each shoulder. One is loving and curious and compassionate, and the other is selfish. Which one will grow, the child asks the elder. The one you feed, the elder replies. Echoing this, Adrienne Marie Brown, in her book, Emergent Strategy, reminds us that what we give attention to, what we pay attention to, grows. So when we are building religious community, we want to be intentional about feeding the healthy parts. Essentially, feeding health is like positive reinforcement. We thank people for contributing their time, their talent, their money. Our rituals like flower communion in the late spring and water communion in the late summer reinforce the positive aspects of this community that we are building. Last week, we had the stone soup service, and we asked you to write on vegetables what gifts you bring, and Sarah and I will be posting these next week for those of you to see because they were fantastic. We celebrate new members with ritual, reinforcing the values of the community. When people engage in healthy behaviors like direct communication, showing up for one another, speaking the truth in love, or reflecting on how our faith calls us to not just live on Sunday mornings, but to live in the rest of our lives. These are healthy behaviors, and we want to highlight them, to feed them, to nourish them so that they continue to grow. And behaviors that are not so healthy, the wisdom we ministers are taught says that we should starve dysfunction. Don't give dysfunction the energy it needs to grow. Now, you don't want to completely ignore or deny something dysfunctional. If you do that, it actually can grow. Instead, we want to notice it, acknowledge it, but not give it energy. In building religious community, I most often see dysfunction when people put their own individual wants above those of the congregation, often without even realizing it. For example, when someone says that if they don't get their way, they will reduce their financial support or will leave the congregation. You don't want to ignore this person completely because they are probably hurt or frustrated. They're just not necessarily dealing with it in the most healthy way. Instead of ignoring them or feeding them by scurrying to do whatever they demand, we can talk to that person about their frustration, about their fears, about what they are hoping to accomplish really, because there's the surface and then there's really what's going on. Dysfunction usually occurs when people feel defensive and lash out. We don't want to ignore these behaviors, but we also don't want to cave into them to feed them because we don't want them to grow. When someone is engaging in dysfunctional behavior, we can acknowledge the behavior without feeding it by pointing out the dysfunctional behavior and suggesting alternatives to it, training the community to embrace more healthy behaviors. But what happens when dysfunction sometimes escalates into harm? What do we do when when an individual within that community is actively hurt? For these situations, I have added interrupt harm to the wisdom of feed health and starve dysfunction. The need to interrupt harm as something distinct from starving dysfunction began to crystallize in my mind after the election in 2016. At that point, I started wearing a set of pins and buttons on all my clothes, and I was usually wearing a clerical collar every day with these pins and buttons. The pins and buttons were a Black Lives Matter button, a rainbow flag button, a pin that had the various symbols of the world religions, and finally, a safety pin. At the time, the safety pin was emerging as a way for people to show that they were allies and would not tolerate the violence and abuse that was rampant. But wearing these pins made me ask myself, was this just something that I was doing because I wanted to be seen as a good white person, a good minister? Was it performative, or was I prepared to actually do something? Was I prepared to put myself between a harasser and a Muslim woman? If I saw police beating up a person of color, was I prepared to intervene in some way, or at least get out my phone and start recording? Was I prepared to not be a bystander, but to interrupt harm when I saw it being done? And even closer to home, more frequent and perhaps more difficult, was I prepared to not just let it go when someone I cared about caused harm? I asked myself these questions because I knew I wanted to be a part of creating the beloved community. If I wanted to be a part of it, then I had to up my game. I knew that starving dysfunction would not be sufficient when harm was actively occurring. Like in a garden. Hornworms can ruin a garden overnight, and some weeds are parasitic. They kill other plants by attaching to their roots or the stems. They suck out all the nutrients from the plant, making it weak, and eventually the garden will succumb to disease, starvation, pest infestation. Harmful behavior in a community can have the same result. It can weaken a community and stop growth, stop flourishing. Run amok, unchecked, harmful behavior can even kill a community. The most common form of harm I have seen in religious communities is relational. Relational harm can occur when we spread rumors about someone in parking lot conversations, or when we belittle someone, when we use our privilege to assert our voice over someone else's. To interrupt harm in these circumstances, first we need to notice it, and then we need to do something. Now, sometimes it's really hard to notice when harm is being done. When we have become used to certain behaviors, we are more likely to excuse them or even not notice the harm they caused. I know of a congregation that tolerated someone who was constantly trying to pick up other congregants. Many people slowly disappeared from the church because of this predatory behavior, but the leaders just excused it as saying, oh, well, that's just so-and-so. So the first part of harm is noticing, is paying attention differently, and especially listening and trusting others when they tell us that harm is being done. When we do notice harm happening, whether on our own or if someone else brings our attention to it, we often may go into fight or flight or freeze mode, and so interrupting harm can be challenging. It's not comfortable. Our hearts can start racing. We get afraid. We might ask ourselves, if I do something, will I then become the target? It is often very difficult to interrupt harm because when we are interrupting harm, we are setting a boundary. We feel like we are breaking cultural norms. We are taught to not interfere, to be polite, to go along, to get along, or to praise in public and critique in private. These are all things that we are taught, but these norms can allow harm to grow and flourish. So there's a lot of cultural reprogramming for ourselves that we need to do to overcome when we interrupt harm. It's hard. It does get easier. I promise, with practice, it does get easier. And remember, even though it may not feel nice, it is kind to hold people accountable for their actions, to give them the opportunity to learn and grow, and to let those who have experienced harm know that they are not alone. So, what are some ways that we might interrupt harm if we see it as we are working together to continue to build this community that we love so much? It causes harm to individuals and to a community, to a congregation like this, when a cisgender person says that sharing pronouns doesn't matter. When another person, cisgender person, hears this, they can interrupt harm by saying, I appreciate it when people share their pronouns. I want to make sure that I treat people the way they want to be treated. It causes harm to individuals and to a community when a white person says that we are beyond racism, or when Black congregants are misnamed. We can interrupt this harm by stating at that moment that we disagree, or to correct the misnaming. And if we are also white, by following up afterwards and reaching out to the person who caused harm and helping that person create a plan to apologize and do better in the future. It causes harm to individuals and to a community when we talk about each other, but not to each other, especially when we talk about each other to our friends and try to get them on our sides, creating factions and silos in the community. We interrupt harm like this by asking, have you talked to that person or group directly about your concerns? And so much more. I hope you get the idea. Interrupting harm as we work to build a community together means practicing stepping out of our discomfort, or into our discomfort, out of our comfort and into our discomfort, and holding ourselves and each other accountable to the values and the vision of who we want the community to be. Because just because all people may be welcome here doesn't mean that all behaviors are. If we want to continue to build a healthy, thriving community where here at UUI, where all are welcomed for their whole selves, we want to learn how to recognize and interrupt harm as one of the tools that will encourage this garden to keep growing. Think of it as fertilizer. This is one of the reasons the board is resurrecting and updating the language in the Together in Community Relational Covenant that the congregation passed back in 2008. This covenant provides a set of instructions for how to nurture this garden together. Feed help, starve dysfunction, interrupt harm. This is how together we can build the beloved community of justice and equity in which everyone is cared for and in which we feel brave enough to be our vulnerable, authentic selves. The kind of community that Ted mentioned that actually helps us to live longer. Unlike gardening, or maybe like gardening, this is an art, not just a science. It takes practice. It takes patience, it takes paying attention, it takes grace, both for ourselves and for others. Indeed, this is holy work to continue to build the community we seek, a community centered on love, where we live our values. May it be so. May we make it so.